In 1959, the University of Nottingham sent an expedition to the Tunsberg Glacier in southern Norway to spend 2 months studying how changes in temperature affect the behaviour of the glacier. This was the third in a series of expeditions begun in 1957, all led by John Springthorpe. For me, as a 20-year-old student of civil engineering, it was a chance to get some experience of land survey work in a challenging environment. The Tunsberg Glacier, Tunsbergdalsbreen, is a magnificent river of ice, flowing very slowly and silently down a remote valley from the pristine wilderness of the Tunsbergdalsbreen ice cap, which is now a national park. Climate change is already damaging alpine glaciers, so Tunsbergdalsbreen is now the longest outlet valley glacier on the European mainland. But it's still very remote and almost inaccessible to tourists, so even now not many people have ever seen it, apart from the few who cross the lake to get to the snout. Our long climb up to the glacier began in Krundalen, a valley carved out by the glacier Tunsbergdalsbreen, which in 1959 still lingered as a snowy white icefall at the end of the valley. We spent a week or two carrying 2 tons of stores and equipment up the side of the valley to the Sæter huts at the entrance to the hanging valley of Røykedalen, historically an area of summer grazing for sheep and cattle. Some of the huts were derelict, but there was space here for us to make our first camp. And while we were there, we assembled and painted a number of Stevenson screens that we needed to house thermometers and other instruments up on the glacier. Some of our food supplies had been donated to the expedition, including a few tins of Crawford's biscuits, one of which is seen here on top of my backpack as I set off into Røykedalen. 54 years later, on a return visit in 2013, we discovered that one of the empty tins had miraculously found its way back down to the huts to be used as an ash can. So I put it on top of my backpack and stood again on the same rock for another photo before taking the tin back down to the valley, giving the owner of the hut a full box of biscuits in exchange. Our climb up to the base camp continued all the way along Røykedalen and up the steep slope at the end of the valley, seen here on the right-hand side of this photo. And then we spent days carrying heavy loads up above the snow line, back and forth, again and again. And then there was a long trek across the top of the ice cap at 1,500 metres altitude until we finally had all our stores and equipment at base camp. So this is the view from our base camp, looking down the long, flat midsection of the glacier. It was an idyllic location with panoramic views across the valley. And this was the upper level, flat enough for our 2-man tents, and with space to eat our meals. On the lower level, we rigged a larger tent over 3-sided rock walls, which were still there when we went back in 2015. We were a team of 8, assembled here in the sun for this group photo. Our base camp weather station was a Stevenson screen on a headland close by, erected for scientific rigour on a 2-metre square patch of turf which we carried up from the valley, grass which is still growing there 56 years later in 2015. Down on the glacier midsection, we drilled in a line of poles to measure the speed of flow, which was faster at the centre of the glacier and slower near the sides. But our biggest challenge was to complete the triangulation survey begun the previous year, and this involved using theodolites to measure all the angles between survey cairns built around the glacier. And some of these were on the other side of the valley. Some were quite big, and some were high up in the glacier accumulation zone. Snow levels in the accumulation zone were measured using tachyometry, But to do this, two of us needed to trek across the ice cap to the top of the glacier at 1,600 metres altitude. One of the Stevenson screens was there already, but it was a long way from base camp, so we needed to set up a temporary camp. Then the weather closed in, with blizzards, rain and no visibility, so we spent the next 4 or 5 days trapped, with limited food and no communication with the rest of the expedition team. And you can see here on this photo, by the time the weather began to improve and support arrived, the snow around our tent had melted about a foot more than it had underneath the tent. Meanwhile, back near base camp, meltwater and warmth had created these caves where ice shone a vivid blue, and there was space under the ice sheet with views across the glacier. This flat midsection of the glacier is 5 miles long, 1.5 miles wide, and still several hundred metres deep. Unique in Europe. The tiny black speck in the distance in this photo is one of our team on his way back to base camp, which gives you some sense of the scale of this place. Living and working on this natural wonder in 1959 was a privileged experience that I've never forgotten. In 2006, my wife Pam and I donated my photos to the Norwegian Glacier Museum and Climate Centre in Fjellland, where some of them are still on display. And in 2008, Karen Weichert used this 1959 crevasse photo of me on the front cover of her book about Tunsbergdalsbreen. Then in 2009, 50 years after the original expedition, we began the Tunsbergdalsbreen project, which gave groups of young people the chance to measure annual changes to the lower glacier, below the icefall that had developed where the glacier narrows in this 1959 photo, and where the glacier was already heavily crevassed in 1959 and is now a challenging ice climb back up to the midsection. Then, after failed attempts in 2012 and 2013, in 2015, Derek Daniels, the lead surveyor in 1959, and I returned to the old base camp, thanks to help from the University of Nottingham Mountaineering Club, on an expedition to clear the site of debris we had left there 56 years earlier. Our base camp was near the centre of this photo, on the far side of the glacier, but overlooking it, a magical place of distant views and profound silence, which is still an uninhabited mountain wilderness in the heart of Europe. In 2024, a new drone survey of the glacier was done by scientists from the Norwegian Ice programme, in collaboration with another group of young mountaineers from the University of Nottingham, who provided logistical support. So we should soon know how much depth the glacier has lost in the 65 years since I spent the summer in this beautiful place.